Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε στο Coexistence Hall και στην Αμερικανική Σχολή Κλασικών Σπουδών στην Αθήνα. Ονομάζομαι Denver Graninger και είμαι ο Andrew W. Mellon καθηγητής Κλασικών Σπουδών στην Σχολή και καθηγητής Ιστορίας στο Πανεπιστημίο California Riverside. Η διευθύντρια της σχολής, Bono Westcott, στέλνει θερμές ευχές από τη Σαμοθράκη στους συμμετέχοντες του συνέδριου Islands and Mainlands. Με μεγάλη μου χαρά σας παρουσιάζω την αποστολή και το έργο της σχολής πριν από την απόψινή κεντρική διάλεξη του καθηγητή Malkin. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, good evening and welcome to Coexistence Hall and the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. My name is Denver Graninger and I'm the Mellon Professor of Classical Studies at the school and Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Riverside. The director of the school, Bono Westcott, sends her warm wishes from Samothrace on this very warm evening to the participants of the conference, Islands and Mainlands, organized by the Athens Global Center of Columbia University and hosted by the French School at Athens. I am grateful to Stefano for the invitation to introduce the mission and work of the American School before tonight's keynote lecture by Professor Malkin. Founded in 1881, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, which remains a privately funded, nonprofit educational institution, seeks to advance broadly knowledge of Greece in all periods, from prehistory to the present day, through supporting visiting scholars, training students, and pursuing innovative multidisciplinary research programs. The facilities of the Kolonaki campus support this mission, including public exhibition and lecture space, like the Makrianis Wing and Coexistence Hall, two outstanding libraries, the Blagan Library, which focuses on the ancient Greek world and has 123,000 volumes, and the Gennadius Library, which concentrates on Byzantine and modern Greece and has holdings of 145,000 volumes. An archive facility, which holds the papers of pioneering archaeologists like Carl Blagan and Virginia Grace, as well as those of major figures in early modern and modern Greek culture like George Seferis and Margarita Karapanu. And the Wiener Laboratory for Archaeological Science, with research focus areas in human skeletal studies, archaeobotany and faunal studies, geoarchaeology and material science. There is in addition Loring Hall, a residential facility for students and scholars conducting research or participating in school programs. The school has, from its inception, been closely associated with archaeological fieldwork and today maintains two core excavations, one in the Athenian Agora, which began in 1931, and the other at Corinth, where work has been ongoing since 1896. The school is also charged by the Hellenic Ministry of Culture and Tourism with primary responsibility for all American archaeological research in Greece. Current affiliated projects include fieldwork at Isthmia and Mount Lycaon, and Synergasia projects at Lechian Harbor in the Corinthia, Aya Marina Pyrgos in the Copaic Basin, and at Megalos Peristerius Cave on Crete. The school has an active publications program, including final reports of major affiliated fieldwork projects, and the flagship journal Hesperia, with its supplementary monograph series. The school is committed not simply to supporting research of established scholars, but to training the next generation of scholars across a broad range of disciplines, from short courses on micromorphology, bioarchaeology, and ancient DNA organized by the Wiener Lab, to programs on medieval Greek and paleography hosted by the Gennadius Library, to archaeological training in field schools associated with excavations in the Athenian Agora and Corinth, to the regular program, which I am fortunate to organize, which offers an intensive introduction over 9 months to the topography and monuments of Greece for students in classics, archaeology, and ancient history, and contiguous disciplines from graduate programs in North American universities. In the final analysis, however, the school is about people. It's about contact, exchange, and collaboration, a place to share experience, develop new research questions, and pursue them, animated always and everywhere by a respect and love for all aspects of Greek history and culture, high and low, old and new, near and far. We wish you a productive continuation of the conference and congratulate the organizers for assembling such a compelling program. Thank you for your attention, and I will yield the podium to Stefano.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's a real pleasure to be opening this keynote address offered by Professor Irad Malkin in the context of the conference that we started today and is going to continue tomorrow, titled Islands and Mainlands in Antiquity. I'm Stefanos Gandolfo. I'm the director of the newly established Columbia Global Center here in Athens. And as I was having some conversations earlier today, this morning, a lot of you asked, what does a global center do? And I imagine that maybe some of the audience members here today would also have the same question. So I'd like to answer that for you. And for those who heard it this morning, I apologize. It's going to be a bit of the same. So I like to think of the Global Center here in Athens in terms of what I call the three H's of what we aspire to do. And so first and foremost, the Athens Center is a hub of collaborations with local partners and institutions in creating joint degree programs, joint research programs, and joint initiatives as we're about to launch, for example, a new entrepreneurship venture with the Engineering School of Athens. The second is that the center is a home for Columbia students and faculty. This past year, we've been really privileged and happy to receive more than 75 students from Columbia to do part of their studies here in Greece, with a very big emphasis on classics. We had a course in epigraphy with Paraskevi Marzavu, who is here today with us, and many other disciplines. And third, we really hope that the center will earn a place at the heart of Athens' academic and intellectual life by hosting public events like this one today that might challenge us to think as differently. And I think today what we've been able to achieve through the conference and what we're going to hear today in the keynote, all of this is really ticking all these three of these H's. So I'm particularly happy to be here with all of you today. Now, thematically, the center focuses on classics in archaeology and arts and culture. This is something that we're very happy and proud to do, as this is the heritage that Greece carries forward and shares with the world. But since we're part of a network of global centers around the world, we're also working on several contemporary major global challenges, such as climate change, migration, global health and medicine, and of course, technology and entrepreneurship. If you'd like to find out more of what we do, there's always our website and our LinkedIn page. Before I end, I would really like to express our deepest and my deepest gratitude to the Kanellopoulos Foundation, whose generous support makes this gathering today possible. We're truly grateful for your commitment in advancing scholarship and fostering dialogue across disciplines and across borders. Also, a very big thank you to my co-organizers, John Ma from Columbia University and Koray Kunuk, for very thoughtfully shaping the program and bringing such intellectual rigor and richness to the agenda today. Also, I'd like to thank, of course, Professor Irad Malkin for accepting our invitation and coming here and sharing his knowledge over all these years with us. It's a true honor. Also, I'd like to thank the American School of Classical Studies for very graciously hosting us here today. It's a privilege to be able to end the academic year in the same location where we started only 11 months ago. So really, thank you for having us. And last, I would like to thank my fantastic team, Indre, Marilyn, and Anastasia, for the incredible work that they've put in the past few months in making sure that everything is in place. And last, I would like to thank you, all of you, our speakers, our guests, our participants. Many of you have traveled quite far, and all of you have braved this incredible heat to be here. Your presence and engagement are truly what makes this event special, and I really thank you for coming. So I look forward to the conversations that will emerge from this exciting lecture, and thank you once again, and welcome.
Well, I mean, Irad Malkin needs no introduction, so my job here is to be very brief. I'll just remind you that he's the author of Religion and Colonization in Ancient Greece, 1987, Myth and Territory in the Spartan Mediterranean of 1994, which was recently re-edited with a preface by Nicholas Purcell, or an encomium by Nicholas Purcell, indeed. The Returns of Odysseus, Colonization and Ethnicity, 1998, and A Small Greek World, Networks in the Ancient Mediterranean, 2011. This really constitutes, I think, a very coherent oeuvre. Lately, of course, you've produced a book on drawing lots from egalitarianism to democracy in ancient Greece of 2024. You're also, of course, or you have been the editor of Mediterranean History, a historical review of a book on the Mediterranean paradigm and classical antiquity, and Greek and Roman networks in the Mediterranean. I'll just mention, since we're in Athens, that you've recently been elected a member of the Academy in Athens. But I think what really stands out is the way in which you taught us that to be an ancient historian, an ancient Greek historian, ancient historian in general, you had to be a Mediterraneanist in the broadest sense. I think it's a lesson which we've been constantly learning and trying to grapple with. And it's one of the things we've tried to do in this conference called Islands and Mainland in ancient Greece. So it was, of course, an enormous joy to us when you accepted to be, at such short notice, our keynote speaker, since this conference, which we kind of threw together like a posse at the last minute, at some point said, maybe we should have a keynote speaker, maybe we should have Irad Malkin. Well, thank you for accepting, and please join me in thanking Professor Malkin for what I'm sure will be a fantastic lecture.
Well, thank you so much for this incredibly kind and generous introduction, and I'm truly grateful to be here in this context, especially a subject to which I've dedicated over 30 years as an editor of the Mediterranean Historical Review, which is a multi-period journal, thematic, not chronological, which is, in that vein, I will also try to speak today. Well, a Mediterranean historian, that's what I am. And I think a Mediterranean historian ought to adopt the maritime perspective of the ancient Greeks, Phoenicians, and Etruscans, who preferred to settle on offshore islands and headlands, sites easily defensible and accessible from the sea. On the other hand, from the inland perspective, coastal areas were often regarded as peripheral or marginal, sometimes sparsely populated. For those marine civilizations, the sea was a kind of a hinterland, creating networks of communication that linked islands, headlands, and river deltas across Mediterranean waters. A defining characteristic of such maritime settlements appears to be extended periods of middle ground coexistence. Territorial conquest into the interior typically emerged later, sometimes even much later. This discussion forms part of a broader investigation I'm conducting, drawing from extensive experience in founding and editing that Mediterranean Historical Review. Thus, with a panoptic view of the history of all maritime colonizations, from the ancient Greeks to the modern Dutch, we note a salient feature common to them all: a settlement facing a hinterland, tapping it, to use a British colonialist terminology. Structurally, and I stress structurally, there is little difference between Phoenician Motia next to Sicily, Greek Tassos, and British Hong Kong, an offshore island facing a mainland. Though this sea-to-land orientation, extensive coastal regions with settlements facing seaward operated essentially as island communities, as demonstrated, for example, at Marseille, we'll see later. Greek linguistic evidence proves illuminating. Think of the words Epirus, which is a well-known area in northwestern Greece, but it really describes, it translates as the land opposite, or the mainland territory. This terminology clearly originates from a maritime reference point, likely viewed from Ithaca, I think, and neighboring Ionian Sea islands. The colonial designation Peraia, which we discussed today several times, mainland territory controlled by island states like Samos or Tassos, reflects identical maritime thinking. Glenn Bowersook astutely notes that the ancient Greek and Latin geographers and travelers employ terms such as hyper, anno, ultra, superior, and their antonyms to describe locations and regions from a ship-to-shore context. Upper Libya, for example, representing the Pentapolis territory of Cyrenaica, lies west and north of Lower Libya. So from an inland perspective, however, the sea often appears as the enemy, a source of corruption. This, by the way, is the Mediterranean Historical Review. Coastal regions represented points of vulnerability, gateways for foreign interference and invasion. The extreme measures taken by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars in 13th century Palestine demonstrates how such fears could be expressed and drive radical action. This is a map of the Crusader states in Palestine, and this is our friend Baybars, because after defeating and expelling the Crusaders, Baybars mobilized enormous resources, armies of engineers and laborers to systematically destroy the Palestinian coastline, now under his control. He went so far as to block ancient Phoenician drainage systems, thus deliberately rendering coastal areas uninhabitable. Baybars explicitly declared his purpose, there's a big inscription near Caesarea, to prevent the Frangi, the Christians, from ever returning by ship. The sea itself is an enemy. This represents an extreme response to maritime colonization, where the perceived threats and the mutually exclusive claims of two monotheistic religions, this did not exist in Greek antiquity, was so severe that accommodation became impossible. Unlike other scenarios, no middle ground emerged here, only absolute rejection of seaborne influence. Greg Denning's book, Islands and Beaches, develops the concept of a shoreline as the middle ground spaces for commerce and settlement, serving both maritime arrivals and inland populations approaching coastal areas. Odysseus had already recognized that the island facing the fearsome Cyclops offered excellent settlement potential, particularly since the Cyclops didn't have ships. The observation may serve as a blueprint for Greek perspectives of settlement consistently maritime since the Dark Ages. I know historians like to distinguish between Ionian migrations and Greek colonization of the historical period, but from the 11th through the 5th centuries BCE, Greeks established communities on islands and coastal promontories. The maritime perspective remained constant throughout this period. Greeks accumulated centuries of experience applying consistent site selection patterns from a ship-to-shore perspective, penetrating minimally inland while facilitating short-range coastal navigation and cabotage commerce, simultaneously maintaining contact through extended maritime routes. And whom did they meet? Throughout the world of Greek colonization, extending across the shores of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, Greeks engaged with an extraordinary variety of peoples and civilizations. Greek responses to indigenous populations and the forms of coexistence that emerged varied according to specific local conditions and circumstances. We can identify a complete range of categories, strategies, and arrangements. At one extreme, complete domination, reducing population to serfs or slave status, as apparently occurred at the with the Mariandinoi at Heraclea Pontique. It's marked in yellow on the right-hand side of the map. At the other extreme, we find small commercial establishments such as the trading enclave, the Emporion at Etruscan Gravisca, or modest mixed communities like La Mastuola, situated near Taras, on the left hand in yellow on the screen. Taras itself is more typical of what occupies most of the spectrum, a Greek polis with a clear identity of origin, Sparta in this case, a cohesive set of nomima that include, for example, sacred calendar, social tribal divisions and the terminology, specific cults like the Carnea, the goddess Ortia, whips with astragals for self-flagellation was found, and the terminology of magistracies, even ephors apparently. With exceptions, within the framework of the first two generations of settlers, non-Greek locals did not have a citizen-like share in the polis. Colonization was a historical phenomenon on a grand scale. Under conservative estimates, more than 30% of the total number of all Greek polis in the archaic period were new foundations of colonies. Some people argue up to 50. Colonization was a significant and formative factor in the emergence of what we call Greek civilization, and the differences encountered when confronting non-Greeks were also formative. It is not so much the binary Greek-barbarian contrast as such, but the encounter with very different types of barbarians that heightens a sense of similarity among Greeks who were otherwise keenly aware of their own differences. Take Megara, for example. The barbarians, namely the non-Greeks, whom the Megarians met in Sicily when they founded Megara, Hyblaia, and later Selinus, were very different from the barbarians those Megarians met at Byzantium, impacting Megarian identity in the process in a kind of a back ripple effect. It is one of the aspects of network dynamics, this back ripple effect, compacting an island identity or a mother city identity through the process which I discuss in this book, which tries to apply network theory from physics to the emergence of Greek civilization. So far for the perspective of the colonizer, but that is not my main concern today. What happens when we reverse it? And when we do, should we be talking of native populations? Well, instead of the term barbarians, post-colonial discourse uses a variety of terms such as indigenous, native, autochthonous, aboriginal, and local. Well, the latter term, local, has a more neutral ring because it does not signify permanence. One may be considered local simply by residing without any commitment as to why, how long, since when. By contrast, the other terms all imply some value judgment, implying priority of presence concerning the newly arrived colonists. The much discussed term in post-colonial theory, subaltern, is pertinent to a wider spectrum of questions that concern the perspective of the colonized who have no share in the imperialist culture and need to conform to its language just to be heard. However, the concept of the subaltern still implies and maintains binary generalizations. Think of the work of Spivak, for example, or Ludden. However, my concern here is less with discourse than with actual placement or displacement, movement, and migrations of non-Greek groups in relation to the foundation of new colonies on offshore islands and on the coast, to question the validity also of the term indigenous in a very concrete sense. Based on the picture presented below, the subaltern point of view of local populations may then be discussed more responsibly with further implications. To put it bluntly, post-colonial scholarship presents a dualistic paradigm. Colonizers arrive and either displace or dominate native populations. Colonial actors appear as the antagonists in this narrative, while indigenous populations emerge as the victims. Yet, as I'm about to demonstrate, this analytical model inadequately represents the intricate relationships and their effects on interior lands that characterize Greek colonization. This analytical model really doesn't represent well the intricate relationships and the effects on interior lands that characterize specifically Greek colonization and the seafaring colonization throughout history, more broadly, including ventures by Phoenicians, Crusaders, Venetians, Genoese, Portuguese, Dutch, British, and so on. The binary approach creates a deceptively static, dualistic framework founded on anachronistic concepts derived mostly from 19th century European territorial imperialism, while overlooking extended, centuries-long middle ground phases in the distinctive characteristics of maritime colonization, accomplished primarily on outlying islands and coastal headlands that maintained European separation from interior regions for centuries. Native populations cannot be characterized as unchanging entities during the era of maritime colonization, and coastal settlements generated a powerful attraction or a pull factor from the hinterland. Scholars tend to emphasize the push dynamics, colonists displacing local peoples, far more frequently than this attraction factor. Nevertheless, we can identify non-Greek groups that arrived subsequent to an apoikias establishment while simultaneously displacing other non-Greek populations. This academic hesitation may derive from recognition that first arrival arguments have been exploited for political agendas. The South African example offers a valuable insight. Boer colonists claimed that their great trek antedated Zulu settlements in quite a lot of regions, thus contesting Zulu assertions of native status. While the chronological order may be historically verifiable in particular areas where white settlers indeed preceded black populations, such temporal priority cannot validate racist doctrines, of course. But the case demonstrates how identical historical data produces entirely different analytical inquiries based on the values and theoretical frameworks that guide scholarly theory. Most seafaring colonial establishments, at least during the first few generations, seized comparatively modest territorial holdings, as we shall observe, for example, in the case of Massalia that was founded around 600 BC, that is modern Marseille. Conversely, such colonies frequently generated novel economic and political opportunities that operated like magnets, and like magnets served either to repel certain locals or draw others, occasionally fostering interlocal conflicts and transforming power dynamics among local populations and their elites. Some of these elites emerge in response as elites to fresh possibilities created by Greek colonization. So colonial activity sometimes stimulated migration and movement from interior regions towards the coastal colony, as well as the actual establishment of new native settlements positioned opposite Greek ones. There's a kind of a dissonance in scholarly discourse on the subject between post-colonial theorists, for whom the binary approach is a discourse on victimhood. In contrast, historians, and particularly archaeologists, when examining specific locations, are well aware of the evidence that challenges this binary concept. What I intend to argue may not be a surprise for some of them. I nonetheless maintain that a systematic, comprehensive examination of this phenomenon across global history remains an unfulfilled scholarly objective. In this context, I shall limit myself to one detailed case study. The framework of post-colonial studies has been shaped by the maritime expansion and establishment of modern territorial empires like the French in North Africa or the Belgians in the Congo. However, before the imperial expansion of the late 18th and 19th centuries, European powers outside, except for Brazil and the Americas, typically avoided deep inland penetration or large-scale territorial conquests. Early modern European approaches resembled those of ancient Greeks, establishing coastal settlements, venturing inland only when circumstances permitted, and relying on local intermediaries. Modern colonialism and imperialism, by contrast, followed pattern more similar to ancient Rome than ancient Greece. When Phocaian Greeks founded Massalia, this is southern France here, around 600 BCE, for instance, subsequent Greek settlements spread laterally along what is now the French Riviera. They remained within a narrow coastal strip, rarely extending more than 5 to 15 kilometers inland. Caesar's enormous territorial conquest of Gallia presents a stark contrast, illustrating the difference between these two approaches to expansion and to control. So is there such a thing as indigenous? Strictly speaking, no human population is truly indigenous in the sense of being native or aboriginal to a particular location. Because unlike the mythological Theban Spartoi, humans do not spring from the earth. They have always been mobile for the last, well, several decades of millennia. Objectively, humans are never truly autochthonous. What is interesting, that few societies ever claimed they were autochthonous. Indigenous or native status derives neither from geography nor biology, but from temporal precedence. Put simply, remaining in a place long enough, establishing one as native to that location. The people now called Native Americans were not originally Native Americans. They migrated across the Bering Strait, likely around 20,000 years ago, even though this number gets changed periodically. Time and prior settlement, not origins, establishes their status as native. Now, what about collective emic claims of autochthonous origin? When do people say they are autochthonous? The ancient Greek Arcadians were exceptional in being regarded as old as the moon. And classical Athenians played with the idea of being autochthonous. However, these represent 2 cases out of over 1,000. None of whom claimed to be autochthonous, or almost none. Sparta, for instance, was considered an apoikia, namely colony, of the Dorians, says Pindar, who violently displaced the prestigious lineage of Menelaus and Helen, establishing their own Dorian city over Homeric Sparta. The major exception appears in the ancient Near East, which at the time was a surprise to me, where distinct temporal scales created different perceptions. These civilizations were so ancient that by the first millennium, after 2 millennia at least of recorded history, people assumed they had always existed there, lacking an exodus narrative to shape their collective identity. Unlike the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Greeks, who viewed themselves as young peoples who were absent when the world was created, the ancient city of Eridu was created with the world. That's autochthony, and that's something we don't find in the Mediterranean. Post-colonial discourse sometimes conflates colonialism and colonization. I'd like to warn against this because this is a common misconception, partly because these 2 phenomena indeed overlap in modern history. However, colonialism is a loaded, historically specific term that must be distinguished from the historical phenomenon of Greek colonization, because at its core, colonialism signifies subjection to metropolitan interests, whether Madrid or London, and often involves mercantilistic policies. Greek colonization during the Archaic period, by contrast, involved founding largely independent city-states that maintained religious and symbolic ties with their mother cities without being established to serve those cities' interests deliberately. For example, during the Archaic and Classical period, the relations between the Massaliots, the people of ancient Marseille, and the Celts and the Ligurians were not dictated by the interests and priorities of the Anatolian mother city, Phocaia. They do begin to around 196 BC, but that's another issue. I find that insisting on ethnicity or race as the primary line demarcating difference and exploitation between colonizers and locals is often misleading, as much as ethnicity and race are popular subjects today. And I too wrote about ethnicity. What mattered to many societies throughout history was neither ethnicity nor race, but the type of enemy they faced and the kind of ally they could secure. When some indigenous people, indigenous, now I'm using the word in quotation marks, when some indigenous people threaten other indigenous people, they may seek help from colonizers. Cortés, for example, famously succeeded because of local allies who rebelled against the Aztecs. It's not just a few dozen Spaniards. When the aggressive Muslim jihad of the Fulani, the Sokoto Empire in Africa, advanced on northern Nigeria, some local people sought accommodation while others welcomed and invited British help. Now, should we call the Fulani indigenous and favor them in our value judgment merely because they were Africans while the British were not? Or consider the famous Comanche Amerindians. Comanche, remember them, those fierce Indians? For Europeans familiar with Karl May novels about the Wild West, the Comanches represent the quintessential indigenous Indian hero. But in what sense were these Indians indigenous? Sorry, this is my book on Sparta. And this is the Comanche Empire. Contact with the Spanish introduced the Comanches to guns and horses, which they used to build an empire that subjugated other, let's call them Amerindians, enslaved many, and sold many to white settlers. So it's very nice that they're indigenous, but they're not very nice. Okay. In the Great Lakes region of North America during the extended Middle Ground periods, as Richard White demonstrates, whites were regarded as simply another tribe, like the Iroquois or the Algonquians, with whom one might ally against other indigenous tribes. So again, who are the indigenous, and more importantly, where are they to be found? Alternative distinctions deserve consideration beyond the colonizer-colonized binary. From local perspectives, the categories that truly mattered were often not the modern scholars' colonizer-colonized framework, but rather geographical and lifestyle decisions. The contrast between mountains and plains, for example, as Brodel demonstrated, or the fundamental divide between sedentary and nomadic societies. The Greeks understood this dynamic as well. In the Anabasis, Xenophon draws distinctions between marauding mountain people, such as the Drilai, who raided both Greek colonies and non-Greek settlements alike. These non-Greek villages subsequently sought protection or formed alliances with Greek colonies against their common mountain adversaries. The Trapezontian, the Greeks of the city of Trapesos, would not lead the Greeks to districts from which provisions could be secured easily because they were friendly to the people of those districts. But they were eager to lead them to the territory of the Drilai, at whose hands they were continually suffering losses, though their country was mountainous and difficult to traverse, and its inhabitants the most warlike of all that dwell upon the Euxine. Unlike the terrestrial perspective of the hinterland, maritime colonization operates through a sideways perspective, moving along the coast. In the Anabasis, again, Xenophon observes the parallel streams of maritime traffic at sea and the maritime connections linking coastal colonies that remained isolated from each other by land. While Greek settlements dotted the Black Sea coast and could have aided Xenophon's army, their connections were entirely maritime since they didn't even have overland routes. This fragmented terrestrial situation contrasted sharply with the Greek ships parapleontes sailing by, transporting merchandise that included even books, the first testimony for book sailing in Greek antiquity. So when Xenophon contemplates founding a new city, what's happening here? Even the hostile people who dwelt nearby began now to send envoys to Xenophon to ask what they must do to be his friends. This represents an explicit acknowledgement that prospective coastal colony, though not even yet established, already operates as an attracting force, a kind of a magnet, I aim to examine such subtleties, investigating how colonial encounters transformed regional networks and compelled us to reconsider the fundamental concept of indigeneity. Particularly significant is the phenomenon of indigenous people displacing other indigenous people as they reposition themselves to capitalize on colonial opportunities. I will use the Greeks in southern France as a case study today to explore these dynamics. The central question remains, who were the non-Greeks, local people, and more crucially, where were they located? Well, this is Justinus telling a story about colonization. One day, a pregnant dog begged a shepherd for a place where she could deliver her puppies. Having obtained it, she then asked permission to raise its young there. At the end, once its young had grown up, relying on her troop, the dog arrogated to itself the ownership of the place. Similarly, these Massilians, who now seem to be tenants, would one day become masters of the country. Now, Justinus tells the story as a counterpoint to the initial excellent relations that supposedly existed between the first Phocaian colonists and the local. It was Nanos, king of the Segrobriges, who allowed the Phocaians to settle down in his territory. This colonization folklore presents the two extreme points on the spectrum of relations with native populations. Peaceful, friendly accommodation, even marriage. By the way, the same story is told about Lampsakos, another Phocaian colony, with native populations, and hostility and conquest on the other hand. So archaic southern France, which you see now on the screen, provides an excellent counter-argument to the binary colonialist model of colonizer versus indigenous. Who precisely here qualifies as an indigenous person? In what is now southern France, around 600 BCE? Beyond the nebulous Ligurian, this is both an ethnic and a geographical regional name. What about were they migrating, the Celts, in the immediate and somewhat overlapping northern regions? Should we consider Ligurians indigenous while viewing Celts as invaders? Other foreigners, the Etruscans, were highly active in the region before and one generation after Massalia's founding. We cannot assume that any comprehensive Ligurian collective ethnic identity was somehow suppressed by the colonists. The Greeks who settled primarily along the coast likely did displace some non-Greek locals from coastal areas, while other non-Greek locals displaced still other non-Greek locals to establish themselves in their place and exploit the coastal advantages now provided by the Greek settlement. What proves remarkable, as we shall see, is the absence of any Greek ambition to capture territories, vast territories. Territorial ambition is precisely what distinguishes modern European imperialism, colonialism from these early patterns. Some non-Greeks did not flee or withdraw into the hinterland, but instead moved toward the Greek settlements, even establishing new communities. We'll see examples adjacent to Greek ones. Greeks occasionally reciprocated this approach, which may explain why the city called today Antibes derives its name from Antipolis, namely facing a settlement, apparently a local settlement, a Greek one built in front of it. The outcome was not post-colonial suppression of natives, but rather a middle ground of accommodation, kind of a dance of partners, if you want. By contrast, Massalia's aggressive energies, they did have aggressive energies, were directed more towards the sea. It even conducted several wars with Carthage. Archaeological evidence may imply that the storage structures, the silos and granaries discovered at several local settlements near other Phocaian Massaliot settlements and colonies facilitated commodity exchange, offsetting the typically restricted agricultural territory, or chora, available to those Greek outposts. Understanding these interactions requires a nuanced framework that moves beyond simplistic exchange models. Inhabitants of middle ground networks both Greeks and non-Greeks, seem to have developed cautious approaches that simultaneously preserved cultural distinctiveness while enabling cross-cultural interaction. We must recognize the anachronistic nature of Strabo's perspective, writing centuries later, who regard the Greek cities as teichismata, fortified sites. They were fortified pretty late. While Massalia constitutes an apoikia, most contemporary settlements should be interpreted as enclave groups or emporia featuring ethnically mixed populations and functioning independently of direct institutional ties to either Phocaia, the mother city in Asia Minor, or Massalia. Only in later periods did Massalia establish dominance over some of these settlements. This decentralized, small-scale settlement pattern aligns with broader Phocaian colonization approaches, as demonstrated, I think, by the absence of any Massalia equivalent in the Po Delta on the other side of Italy, in the Adriatic region. Because from the late 6th to the 4th centuries, Greeks coexisted there with Etruscans, Umbrians, and Veneti within intricate middle ground networks that challenged conventional colonial frameworks. Now, Agathe, you see it here on the left on the map, illustrates this process. Having evolved through prolonged middle ground interactions, the earliest Greek peasants, or at least Greek material culture, appears in the indigenous Peyrou cemetery, where several Greek vases dating to the mid-7th century were discovered. During the final third of the 6th century, Phocaian Massalio settlers established themselves along the Bessan River, roughly 15 kilometers inland at La Mondière. You see it above Agathe on the left. Yeah? Simultaneously, they frequented the Agathe site, situated 5 kilometers from the coast, where they eventually founded a permanent settlement near the end of the 5th century. So the exact location of Greek Antipolis, Antibes is marked on the map on the right. I hope you can see it. Probably founded in the late 6th century, had not been identified. Archaeological evidence indicates it was positioned opposite that indigenous village, hence the name, that exhibited strong Greek influences in material culture. The complex arrangement of Greek and native settlements, some newly founded, interacting across brief distances, represents a recurring pattern, also observable at Massalia's later establishment. Nevertheless, this remains essentially a middle ground phenomenon. Neither the Greek components are purely Hellenic, nor are the native settlements culturally uniform. I cannot discuss here the other cases of Olbia, Rhodanusa, and Nice. There's quite a lot of Greek activity in southern France. To further illuminate the early reciprocal relationship, archaeological evidence from Saint-Marcel, you see it marked in yellow at the top, you see the relation to Marseille, and this is 10 kilometers, so this is about 7 kilometers distance. So, this site provides crucial insight. Situated merely 7 kilometers inland from Massalia, this indigenous settlement was fortified around 575 BC, namely within the first generation of Massalia's foundation. While containing Greek and Etruscan artifacts, the site appears distinctly non-Greek and seems to have been established, or rather developed, from a concentration of small habitats, well, in direct response to the Greek presence at Marseille. The fact that this positioning occurred within the first generation of Greek settlements demonstrates how quickly local populations adapted to and engaged with the colonial presence. The nearby site of Roque de la Croix, you can see it on the map marked in yellow, was occupied during the first half of the 6th century, concurrent with Massalia's first 50 years. Coastal areas, I said, may appear peripheral and marginal to hinterland inhabitants. And in southern France, the littoral zone seems to have held little appeal for non-Greeks before the foundation of Massalia. It was pretty sparsely populated. However, newly established coastal settlements generated fresh economic opportunities that drew population from the interior. who engaged in production and trade with the newcomers. This represents the reverse direction of displacement and expulsion. While immediate settlement areas were likely harshly treated, with local population probably forced to relocate further inland, we can see the analogy of Sicilian Syracuse, for example. The situation was more complex. Since natives were not a monolithic group, we also find indigenous peoples moving towards the coast. This dynamic, again, differs fundamentally from colonialist mercantilism. Semblés. Okay? I'm sorry, I cannot point you with that. Oh, is this a pointer? Maybe it is. The site of Semblés demonstrates the typical dynamics of regional middle ground networks. Greek colonization triggered dramatic expansion and settlement, including construction of substantial stone fortifications there that combined Greek masonry techniques with indigenous architectural practices. Semblés' growth coincides with the decline or abandonment or smaller indigenous settlements in the surrounding area. So you have Semblés rising, small indigenous settlements around it declining, and all this in response to Marseille in Greek colonization. Positioned on elevated ground among lakes, Semblés enjoyed access to both the sea and the étang de Berre. The settlement operated as a mixed community, a form of international emporium accommodating local populations alongside Etruscans and Greek residents. Around 500 BC, it came under the control of Massalia. This pattern again challenges simplistic colonial narratives. Indigenous population were not strictly autochthonous, and social divisions typically followed class lines in this case, elites rather than ethnic boundaries. The phenomenon of neutral Greek influence on non-Greek populations, again, the antithesis of cultural imperialism, becomes most apparent through alphabetic diffusion. Alphabetic diffusion patterns rather than direct political or economical dominance. The process produced regional distinct results. Celtic societies maintained Greek-style scripts. Northern Spanish Iberians adapted 7th century Phoenician models into semi-syllabic systems, and Ligurian communities modified Etruscan alphabets, themselves derivative of Greek. Between these peripheral areas, Ionian Greek alphabetic traditions, and the Phocaian were Ionian, achieved much broader acceptance, indicating varying mechanism of cultural transmission across Mediterranean contact zones. No authority explicitly imposed Greek-style alphabets. The adoption occurred within middle ground contexts. Such middle ground arrangements operated as dynamic systems where balanced among diverse participants created conditions for flexible cultural transmission. The colonial middle ground initially displayed extraordinary diversity and dynamism, extending across space for extended periods with apparent balance sustained through the activities of individuals, small groups, various local peoples, Greeks, Phoenicians, and Etruscans, no single power achieving supremacy. Over time, however, Massalia gradually absorbed certain emporia, founded new subcolonies at the regional level, converting coastal southern France into a distinctly Massaliot region. Like with modern European imperialism from the 19th century, this interpretative approach adds a temporal dimension to a transformation that unfolded over several centuries. The pattern of new settlement positioned opposite each other, or Antipolis foundations, represent a recognized phenomenon across different colonization contexts in human history. The dynamic appears in Robert Bartlett's excellent analysis of medieval European expansion and colonization, in Norman Etherington's work on South Africa, and Kenneth Kelly's research on the Bight of Benin. In certain cases, as Kenneth Kelly demonstrates in 7th century Dahomey, entire political entities modeled on European structures emerged to interact, in that case mostly in the slave trade, with European coastal arrivals. These coastal zones operated as genuine middle ground precisely because neither Europeans nor Dahomeans had previously occupied them. Dahomey presents a pattern that challenges post-colonial binary discourse and offers a significant historical analogy, not in its content, but in its structure. The African state remained independent for nearly 2 centuries while committing atrocities against other Africans, notably functioning as the central hub at the place called Ouida for the slave trade. Drawn by new coastal opportunities, this initially backward inland vassal kingdom organized an army, invaded and conquered the coast, creating a kingdom that its king thought manipulated European rivals while selling slaves to all parties. Again, who precisely are the indigenous or the subaltern in this narrative? Such observations demand reconsideration of the simplistic Orientalist frameworks. Europeans arrived by sea, while indigenous population advanced from the interior, sometimes displacing, conquering, or enslaving other native groups, with both converging on the coastal middle ground zones. Colonization thus generates what might be called antithetical imitations, new cultural formations where Dahomeans developed by their perceived as European style state structures, which looked very bizarre to European, while European cultural elements spread through channels unfamiliar to contemporary European. Southern France, let's go back there, reveals additional complexities. Certain indigenous cities, populations, at the port city of Lat, on the left-hand side here, I'll drop it, ancient Latara, near modern Montpellier, established themselves as intermediaries following Etruscans and subsequently Greek Massaliot colonial contact. During the 5th century, an elite district developed, featuring architectural elements that merge indigenous building methods with colonial influence styles. The evidence indicates that these elites managed the redistribution of Mediterranean wine and other imports to the interior communities, as demonstrated by the concentration of storage facilities in specific compounds. The development of emporia, both independent and Massaliot-sponsored, produced a parallel arrangement of indigenous settlements alongside Greek coastal settlements, as studied by Michel Batz. Some were positioned close to Massalia, yet fortified, suggesting tense relations. During the 4th century, Massalia founded several more colonies, notably Olbia, around 350, which doubled the number of parallel indigenous settlements as well. Over approximately 2 centuries, we observed dynamics of population attraction, a well-known documented phenomenon in social geography. These dynamics generated mediating coastal regions where Greek and non-Greek settlements literally confronted each other, likely interdependent in commerce, agriculture, and labor. The degree of dependency and hostility, particularly concerning Massalia, that remains frustratingly unclear due to the retrospective perspective of late Roman sources. I mentioned Strabo before. The Greek-barbarian divide is therefore far from binary. The situation is complex, encompassing enclaves and emporia, as well as gateway communities, where non-Greeks migrated from interior regions to coastal areas and established new settlements in response to the arrival of new maritime colonists. This process fundamentally challenges certain current post-colonial approaches to ancient colonization, and there are some scholars too influenced by that, I'm afraid. Instead, a middle ground culture emerged along the shores, with influences extending into the hinterland, often through river networks. However, no central authority existed behind the coasts, no empire. The center consisted of diffusion and diversity. The center consisted of diffusion and diversity. When discussing the Phocaians or the Greeks in the Western Mediterranean, we might need to eliminate the definite article in favor of a more sophisticated network understanding. The Phocaian colonists who founded Massalia first provided its natural harbor, now Massalia's or Marseille's Vieux Port, with its clear seaward orientation. Concerning the hinterland, the resulting trade network generated reciprocal transformations among both Greek settlers and native population. Ancient Arles, for example, it's marked by the arrow, occupies a strategically superior position to Massalia, superior in terms of controlling the Rhône, the region's main inland trade artery. You know the studies of Michael Dietler on this. However, its location proved disadvantageous for what? For Mediterranean commerce, situated roughly 30 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast. These contrasting settlements reveal the region's complex cultural terrain. Hinterland Arles evolved as an integrated Greek and local community with hybrid features. Coastal Massalia, by contrast, preserved its identity as a purposely founded colony, a quintessential Greek polis with distinct cultural boundaries and well-defined political organization. Further inland, in the middle Rhône Valley, beyond direct colonial influence, we encounter additional non-Greek settlements that appear to have strategically, newly founded, positioned themselves as intermediaries. Non-riverine sites such as Le Mardouel or Nage exhibit substantial growth and increased social stratification, corresponding with their locations along trade routes linking coastal colonies with interior regions. Specific elite compounds manage specialized storage facilities, and archaeological evidence indicates these elites navigated both colonial and indigenous cultural practices. Though largely undocumented, indigenous political and economic networks certainly did exist, involving local interests that operated independently of Greek colonial concerns, as the Peshmaho tablet illustrates. This is the text, which I will not have time to get into. Alleged agreement with 3 witnesses, none of them is Greek. One might characterize the interaction of Greek and non-Greek communities as a dance of middle ground partners in network, forming local clusters with shifting connections and no definitive center. So to close, in summary, the establishment of new cities and emporia frequently created opportunities for certain indigenous groups to reposition themselves as cultural and economic intermediaries, sometimes gaining advantage over other indigenous communities in the process. The binary discourse surrounding modern colonialism appears, therefore, inapplicable and misleading. Once we problematize the concept of the indigenous, however, we obtain a far more complex picture of the movement of Greeks and non-Greeks across a spectrum of contexts, from the conservative Greek polis of Massalia with the mixed community of Arles to the coasts and their emporia and cities with a middle ground history spanning several centuries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Malkin, for presenting the various dynamics at work between colonizers and indigenous, autochthonous, I don't know what to call them, I'll probably call them local people, and also giving us a wide perspective and examples from other cultural areas, other civilizations, and through different periods. We've reached the end of a very long day for those who participated in the Islands and Mainland conference. I think we have deserved a drink. What do you think? So I'd like to invite you to have a drink just outside and remind you that there will be a bus at 10 o'clock just outside the American School, which will take us back to the hotel. And we'll meet again tomorrow morning for the final day. Thank you very much.